Well, perhaps we should get started if everyone's back. Our first speaker today is Christopher Wendt of the European University Institute in Florence. He's going to speak on civil servant struggles to resuscitate the state in post-Habsburg North Tyrol. Christopher, take it away.
Great. So thank you. I want to start by thanking, of course, Alexander and Dasha for putting on this conference, and thank everyone who has hung with us this far, whether it's early, in the middle of the day, or late. And with that, I'll just jump right in. And I'll start with a kind of short anecdote, as one often does. So in early March of 1919, the acting district captain of Lienz, Erich Knoissel, composed a grim assessment of administrative affairs in East Tyrol. As he warned, the provincial government in Innsbruck administration, and in particular the task of food provisioning, reintegrating veterans, and beginning to record war damage claims, was suffering and at a critical time. As Knoissel warned, the best way to resist the Bolshevik influences which from neighboring lands creep ever closer is a flawlessly functioning dynamic administrative apparatus which preemptively removes the breeding grounds of these unfortunate influences so that the population has in no way grounds for dissatisfaction. Knoissel, who was calling for more support from Innsbruck, drew a straight line between poor bureaucracy and revolution, but he also indicated the precarious position of formerly imperial Tyrolean officials in the wake of war. And so at this point, let me say thank you for allowing me to explore a topic that extends beyond the chronological framework of this conference and also concerns a subject area that contributions were supposed to escape, and that is the state. And that is, I consider the positions of a group of post-Habsburg bureaucrats as they navigated the transition out of empire, and I question what that meant for the state and its standing in relationship with society. And I focus on an upper layer of the provincial civil service in the Tyrolean districts, the Bezirkshauptmänner and those assisting them in the immediate post-war years, with an eye towards their experiences, the conflicts that emerge between them and citizens, and their strategies for coping. The presentation therefore revisits the state transition process in North Tyrol and more broadly for provincial German Austria, if one extrapolates. In general, the existing historiography speaks to the strong continuities in terms of personnel and function between imperial civil services and their successors. And exciting regional or department specific studies by many of those who are present today or have presented already or will present have shown how even in the case of supposedly strongly nationalizing Habsburg successor states, imperial civil servants who are held to be even of non-titular nationalities were often kept at their posts, rehired, and or slowly phased out. And one might expect that in the case of North Tyrol, the portion of the crown land of Tyrol not formally annexed by Italy, that became part of the First Republic of German Austria and then the Republic of Austria, the situation would be even smoother. After all, the area was at least in linguistic terms, highly German-speaking monolingual, and especially in the late monarchy, it was known popularly and discursively self-constructed as the most loyal of all Habsburg domains. However, as Knoissel's report hints at, the post-war transition for provincial bureaucrats in Tyrol was less than seamless. But what exactly were the repercussions of the war and its aftermath for these officials? How did the relationship with the governed change as the latter went from imperial subjects to Republican citizens? And what did this mean for the post-war state in the Austrian provinces? Now, I ultimately argue that provincial civil servants in Tyrol were moved to recalibrate their approach towards citizens. In effect, provincial officials lost some of their ability to arrogate and instead were compelled into more circumspect negotiations with citizens that aimed at accommodation, but with some unintended consequences. So in the following, I draw on mostly administrative documents from the Tyrolean Provincial Archives to address district officials' experience of the collapse, how disgruntled citizens pressed their claims, and finally, how district officials' responses may have led to administration in a new key. And I also make use of the retrospective autobiographical account of an interwar Tyrolean district captain, Erich Knoissel. And I thank those of you out there who alerted me to this source and put me in touch so that I could get at it. Okay. So there's already been a lot of research on civil servants' subordination to and friction-filled relationship with military authorities after the outbreak of the Great War, and especially in terms of provisioning and policing the population. And indeed, a great deal of the evidence marshaled to support the argument that popular resentment to harsh military measures and the bureaucracy's complicity in enforcing these was a major factor for declining loyalty to the Habsburg state has been drawn from Tyrol, although mostly from its southern and more Italian-speaking areas. However, by 1917 and 1918, stronger reactions to bureaucratic overreach also erupted in largely German-speaking North Tyrol. And while criticism of the government was most vocally directed against Vienna and, of course, the Zentralen, the regional administration and the legally trained Konzeptsbeamten staffing its offices in Innsbruck and in the outlying districts also came under fire. Speakers at the German Bauerntag, Farmers' Congress, organized by the powerful Catholic Tiroler Bauernbund, lambasted the Habsburg bureaucracy in June of 1918 in a charged atmosphere in Innsbruck that was repeated then in other Tyrolean locations prior to the war's end. And that's indicative of this rising anti-state attitudes. When the monarchy began to disintegrate, the political party leaders who assumed the place of imperial authorities did indeed seek continuity, as in many other cases. Accordingly, on November 1st, 1918, the Tyrolean National Council, the Tiroler Nationalrat, that took charge of regional governance in Innsbruck in place of the imperial Statthalterei, called for all existing authorities to remain in place with their previous powers. However, in these early November days, an overriding sense of breakdown colored reports sent by district captains from North Tyrolean districts who were occupied with the retreat over the Brenner of the Habsburg army and in managing the stream of disillusioned and underfed soldiers as best they could. In many cases, however, as the reports tell, events had passed out of their hands. And in two North Tyrolean districts, district captains were actually forced out by local residents, one in these days of imperial collapse, and the other in the following period of reconsolidation. In Lienz, as we can see a postcard of it here, the district capital of what was becoming known as East Tyrol, District Captain Josef Rossi was, as he claimed, violently removed by a vice mayor and a local military commander on the pretext of his Italian-sounding name, replaced temporarily by a Lienz National Council. And in Reute, another district center far from Innsbruck, political notables rallied residents against District Captain Karl Franz Peer and established a parallel district committee that floated the territory's secession from Tyrol and attachment to neighboring Bavaria. And although Peer remained at his post and persisted through this attempt, another attempt at his removal in March 1919, when armed citizens sought to present him with an ultimatum, ultimately led to his removal the following month and transfer back to Innsbruck. And it's important to note that in both cases, these were not officials who had been placed in charge at the end of the war and who were unfamiliar with their district's residents. Rather, Rossi had served as district captain in Lienz since before the war, and he had even chosen to remain after suffering serious injury in a horse accident while on duty in May of 1914. And he cited his need to fulfill his patriotic duty while others were called to war. Peer had led the district headquarters in Reute since 1916 and guided it through this period of intense privation. But of course, both district captains ran into challenges that confronted provincial bureaucrats as a whole in the immediate post-war period. So in both Lienz and Reute, but also in these further Tyrolean districts, these district captains found themselves at pains to recover the previously held authority. The most sensitive issue, of course, continued to be food provisioning. In Rossi's case, his detractors charged that he had failed to uphold a functioning system during the war, while Peer was blamed for a failing food supply after the war and for corruptly favoring a local merchant. And to cite one pregnant example, in the immediate post-war years, as district captains once again continued to be responsible for ensuring that delivery quotas were met. This responsibility continued to engender friction. In Landeck district, for example, a local representative of the Tiroler Bauernbund attacked the district officials, Heinrich Giovanelli and Julius Manzani, over their treatment of a local mayor. The letter started by casting doubt on the officials' German qualifications, lamenting how foreign named officials stand at the head of a German Tyrolean district. Further, the officials were declared unfit for service in a democratic state. It is incomprehensible to me, both the representative, how a district captain could act against a freely elected representative of the people in such a way. Next thing you know, the mayors will be rounded up by fixed bayonet. And this is the Republican freedom that is had in Tyrol. The district captain, Marzani, was eventually compelled to compose an apology to the aggrieved mayor. And this is a particularly ironic outcome, considering that until the end of 1918, Marzani had been stationed in Merano in South Tyrol and was dismissed by the occupying Italian authorities after he had proclaimed his loyalty to Austria. And in the end, there's little evidence of a pattern of organized resistance to bureaucratic authority in the Tyrolean countryside, but cases of individual rural resistors who refused to participate in provincial supply schemes were definitely not lacking. In addition, both urban and rural communities conditioned their participation on reciprocal engagement and fairness. Similar calls for justice extended to work disputes and work stoppages across Tyrol spiked. Of course, just as many citizens pushed back against bureaucratic authority and perceived abuse, other encounters attest to the sense of recognition that district officials continued to enjoy. When notables again sought to drive District Captain Pierre out of Reuter in March of 1919, for example, he received support in the form of a letter from 8 municipal governments of the district, which praised Pierre's wartime and post-war engagement on behalf of the district, and especially in terms of supporting soldiers' leave requests and seeking to rural residents' nutrition. As these men wrote, Pierre had, and I quote, done much more than he was obligated to do. Oops, problem with the power. There we go. So clearly, regional officials faced a muddled reception in the transition to a new republic. The question is, as they sought to reclaim their legitimacy of old, did they actually change their style of administration? And I'll cite what I find interesting example here. So after a particularly stormy meeting of the Tyrolean Bauernbund leadership, at which complaints of farmers' rough handling by district authorities were aired, Georg Polkels, the chief bureaucrat in the province, sent a circular to all district captains. And this text began as a sort of pep talk to district officials, in which Polkels noted the hardships that they faced, including dire economic conditions, the unconsolidated circumstances of the state, and a decline in public officials' general esteem. Nevertheless, he urged, we must strive with all of our strength, above all, to maintain the regular order and reputation of the district captaincies, despite all of the nearly unjustified attacks. For the district captaincies form the basis, the foundation of our whole administration. And he then closed with a prompting. It was crucial that officials display the utmost accommodation and willingness to serve. We must by no official act forget that we are there for the population and are the servants of the people. And this meant that care had to be taken with citizens. As experience teaches, quiet listening, letting the other speak, and the friendly response to the issue of the party and the explanation of the legal or actual hindrances that confront their wishes is the best method to calm the population and to shore them up in their conviction that they see in the officials of the district captaincies not their enemies, but rather their qualified friends and advisors. This language is notable, it seems, as it denotes at least a rhetorical shift from pursuing the interests of the state to those of the populace, that is the people. But was such a statement accompanied by a change in attitudes or actions of the district authorities? And I would say both yes and no, so that the answer, of course, is somewhere probably in the middle. So district captains could still apply or support coercion, as it had been, of course, often done during the war, and especially in cases of resistant farmers. Gendarmes were still sent out to ensure deliveries. But it is impossible to look around the fact that politics were becoming more involved. District captains had to act sensitively so as not to upset powerful regional political players, such as the Bauernbund, especially as the Bauernbund, as part of the Christian Social Tiroler Volkspartei, had the largest representation in the provincial parliament, and now, in contrast to the war, also headed the provincial government. In this sense, the experiences of Knoissl, recorded in his retrospective autobiographical account, are instructive. Knoissl was dispatched from Innsbruck to Lienz in December 1918 after District Captain Rossi was expelled. And he arrived at the end of December to find the Lienz National Council effectively in charge of local administration, with district bureaucrats following its directives. Instead of pursuing an open confrontation with the council, Knoissl let it continue, but stopped district subordinates from carrying out its orders. Soon after, he recorded, the outlying rural municipalities came to stand behind the district captaincy, and the National Council found itself more and more in need of help from Knoissl, until the point that it ceded all of its agendas back. Knoissl's telling, this is a quote, "A few months after my arrival in Lienz, the authority of the district captaincy was again completely fashioned." In resurrecting the district captain's office, Knoissl utilized the trusted strategy of forging bonds with local social and political notables. He built close relationships with local Christian social leaders and clergy, whom he admittedly felt close to in his own political convictions. And he prided himself on fostering working relations also with those of other political views, such as local German nationalists and social democrats. But it was the rural population, and more specifically the district's Bauernschaft, that he described as the strongest support. He credited their backing with reviving the district office's authority, and saw their advocacy as crucial in securing his promotion as permanent district captain in Lienz. And in turn, he repaid this support by turning a special eye to agricultural interests and using a light hand in cases of unrest. When resistance to mandated agricultural medical insurance surfaced in rural communities in the following years, Knoissl chose an enlightenment campaign over penal measures. As he remembered it, it was back then an unusual novelty that the head of a district went from community to community and held public gatherings. So on the one hand, the drawing in of important social actors at the district level marked a wider distribution of power that, while helping to re-legitimate bureaucratic authority, also set limits on its arbitrary extent. And within this process of post-imperial transition, I would argue that this alliance between district officials and some social elites can be seen as the further enmeshing of the state with society. On the other hand, this form of cooperation was only open to certain partners, such as the conservative Bauernbund leaders. And other chosen social partners were more damaging in the long run. In the turbulent days of imperial collapse of November 1918, the new Tyrolean National Council had actively supported the formation of local guard units to ensure peace and order and to protect property. And although most of these units had disbanded by the spring of 1919, they could easily be recalled through local initiatives. And almost all of these were actually actively supported by the responsible district captains. Now, many of these groups eventually served as the basis for the Tiroler Heimatwehr, a conservative paramilitary organization that, while struggling to gain traction in the early 1920s, emerged as a political force in its own right by the end of the decade, and one that was very much set against the post-war democratic order. But they did so partly by way of assistance lent by the Tyrolean bureaucracy. To be sure, directions given from the top of the provincial political leadership contributed. Franz Stumpf, who became provincial governor of Tyrol in the summer of 1921, was key in instructing his district captains to cooperate with local Heimatwehr groups, treating them as extensions of the state. But even before this official directive, many district officials readily forged partnerships with the civic militia. Looking back from the perspective of July 1927, when the Heimatwehr were called out to break social democratic strikes after the Schattendorf verdict, Knoissel noted, the mobilization of the Heimatwehr occurred with my assistance and following the organization that I had created in 1919, when repeatedly radical elements in Lienz threatened to incite disturbances against which the gendarmerie alone did not suffice. So in forging these immediate post-war alliances, Knoissel and other district captains may have secured their position in a period of post-war insecurity, but ultimately surrendered a key agenda of the state, the monopoly on violence. So in this presentation, I have tried to consider what happened to Habsburg bureaucrats in the remnants of a crown land after the fall of the empire. And as we have seen, they were essentially under pressure from the war and the wounds that it left to do more with less. Formally, most, but not all, former high-ranking officials in North Tyrol were taken into the service of the German-Austrian state without too much hassle. They took new oaths and sometimes new titles, but they mostly still had their jobs. However, they had work to do to regain the legitimacy that they had lost during the war. Although I will say that sometimes the sense of recognition or gratitude extended to them is surprising. And to do so, they had to tread lightly, and they had to start making alliances. So while the civil service had begun to undergo politicization at the end of the monarchy, it seems that district captains in question in this study were forced to take sides to an even greater degree after the war. And if they mostly partnered with traditional power brokers in Tyrol, such as the Bauernbund, they also served to rubber stamp groups that even after the stabilization of the state would work to pull apart this very state that they had created. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.